I never imagined that being forced to live with my own mother's choices could twist my life into a horror story. After my stepdad passed away suddenly, and under suspicious circumstances, I was left reeling from grief and uncertainty. Instead of offering comfort, my mom decided that the best way to move on was to bring home her new boyfriend, Keith. From the very beginning, something about him was off. I was already living in a cramped apartment with memories of better days when suddenly, I found myself shoved into a living arrangement that felt more like a trap than a home. Keith wasn't your run-of-the-mill, nice guy. He had an unnerving way of smiling that didn't reach his eyes and a presence that made every room feel claustrophobic. Almost immediately, I noticed his behavior was not just awkward, but disturbingly invasive. Every time I passed by, he'd make lewd comments under his breath or linger too close, his gaze sliding over me in a way that made my skin crawl. My mom brushed off my discomfort with a flippant, "You're overreacting," as if my own body language was a prank. But the truth was, I felt violated every time he joked about how much I resembled a younger version of her long-lost beau, or worse, an object of desire meant to fill the void in their strange little family. In those long nights when the silence of the apartment became a noisy reminder of my isolation, I began to piece together that nothing was as it seemed. My stepdad's death had been a tragedy, but whispers and hushed conversations suggested that Mom might have had more to gain than sorrow from his passing. The atmosphere was thick with secrets, and with every furtive glance exchanged between Mom and Keith, I sensed that my inheritance, the small fortune meant to honor my stepdad's memory, was at the center of their twisted plans. I'm still reeling from those early days, questioning every decision I made. Was it the weight of grief? Or was I being slowly manipulated into a scenario I could never have imagined? Every day I woke up wondering if the door would creak open to reveal Keith lurking in the hall, or if Mom would casually drop another half-truth about the good fortune that now seemed to have chosen our family as its beneficiary. Each morning, I awoke to the stale smell of coffee and anxiety, a reminder that nothing in our creaking old house was ever as it seemed. The silence was punctuated by the uneven thump of Keith's heavy footsteps in the hall and the persistent murmur of my mother's forced cheerfulness. I could hardly believe that I had become a permanent resident in this twisted tableau of familial betrayal. The events of the previous days played relentlessly in my mind. The unsettling glances from Keith, my mother's evasive justifications, and that gnawing suspicion that the sudden accidental death of my stepdad was no mere misfortune, but a meticulously engineered scheme. The inheritance, my stepdad's modest fortune, was a prize I hadn't even had a say in claiming, yet it had become the focal point of every conversation and covert maneuver within these walls. I began to notice details that I'd previously dismissed. The creak of the floorboard at odd hours, the hushed whispers in the dead of night, and a mysterious locked drawer in my mother's desk that I wasn't allowed near. My curiosity, mingled with dread, pushed me to explore the corners of our home that I had long avoided. Every shadow seemed to hide another secret. Every echo carried a hidden threat. Late one night, when even the air outside was restless, I crept down the darkened corridor. My heart pounded as I approached my mother's study. The door was slightly ajar, and I could make out the flicker of a computer screen from within. Silently, I eased the door open just a crack, careful not to alert anyone to my presence. Inside, I found an array of documents spread across the desk. Bank statements, a will bearing my stepdad's hesitant signature, and a series of coded memos. I discovered that my mother had orchestrated meetings with Keith and even hired a lawyer with a mysterious past. Every paper confirmed what I had feared. The inheritance was more than a monetary sum. It was a gateway to power and revenge. In one document, scribbled in hurried handwriting, were details of a plan that dated back months. It outlined how my mother, following my stepdad's untimely death, had manipulated every circumstance to secure the fortune that was rightfully meant for me. Keith's presence wasn't a coincidence. He was the outside catalyst, someone who could be used as both a distraction and a pawn in her grand scheme. The deeper I delved into those documents, the more the lines between victim and conspirator blurred. Had my stepdad's death been engineered? Was my mother involved in something far more sinister than I had ever imagined? And what of Keith's unnerving behavior? Was it a simple perversion, or was he following orders, acting as the muscle and enforcer for their dark agenda? A draft email caught my eye, dated just a week before the funeral. It read like a cold business transaction. Ensure that all contingencies are in place before we finalize the new arrangement. Our next step will be to solidify the trust. The inheritance must be secured at all costs. I shuddered as I realized that this email wasn't addressed to my mother. It was sent to Keith, who had confirmed his role as both confidant and accomplice. In the weeks that followed, my existence became a relentless battle between dread and determination. I was constantly on edge, questioning every smile, every casual remark, and every secret meeting that I glimpsed in the periphery. I began to keep a journal, documenting every incident, every odd conversation, and every instance of Keith's inappropriate advances. Each entry was both a confession and a piece of evidence against the conspiracies swirling around me. One particularly harrowing afternoon, I found myself cornered in the kitchen by Keith. As I reached for a glass of water, he leaned in too close. "Hey, kid," he murmured with a too friendly smirk. "Why do you always look so tense? Is it just the weather, or is there something more exciting going on in that mind of yours?" His voice dripped with a false charm that belied the malicious intent behind his words. I backed away, my heart pounding, while he chuckled darkly. It was then that I realized how deeply his behavior was woven into the fabric of this nightmare. That evening, as storm clouds gathered and the wind howled outside, I sought refuge in the solitude of my bedroom. The diary lay open on my lap, and I began to write furiously about the day's events. Each word was a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control over a life that was spiraling beyond my grasp. But as I wrote, I felt an uneasy presence at the door, a reminder that in this house, privacy was an illusion. My mind kept returning to the day of my stepdad's death. I recalled the hushed tones at the funeral, the discreet glances exchanged between my mother and a shadowy figure whose identity was concealed behind a veil of pity and regret. In the months following his death, rumors had circulated among family friends about the true nature of his passing. Some whispered of foul play. Others hinted at a deep-seated family feud that had culminated in his downfall. I began secretly reaching out to those who had known him best. A childhood friend who worked as a mechanic, a neighbor who often visited the family home, even distant relatives who had been quietly critical of my mother's behavior. Piecing together these fragments of conversation, I discovered that my stepdad had been a man of honor, beloved by those who knew him for his kindness and integrity. His death, therefore, was not a random accident, but something far more calculated. I learned that in the days leading up to his demise, he had become increasingly paranoid about threats to his life and fortune. He'd started keeping a ledger of suspicious activities, noting down any names or incidents that felt off. Unfortunately, his warnings were drowned out by the mourning and the orchestrated display of grief. It seemed that in the chaos of loss, the truth had been buried beneath layers of lies and half-truths. As I continued my investigation, I found an unexpected ally. Cassandra, a quiet, perceptive girl from my class who had always seemed to observe life from the sidelines. Cassandra, with her ink-stained notebooks and an uncanny knack for uncovering hidden truths, had been watching my family's unraveling with quiet concern. One rainy afternoon, she approached me in the library, her eyes searching mine, as if seeking to confirm a shared understanding of the unspoken horror that haunted our lives. "You're not the only one who's noticed," she whispered, sliding a worn envelope into my hands. Inside were copies of financial records, letters, and even a photograph of my mother and Keith, arms draped over each other in what appeared to be a conspiratorial embrace. Cassandra had been gathering evidence of her own, convinced that something was amiss. Together, we pored over every document, every whispered rumor. Late-night meetings in abandoned corners of the school and hushed conversations in dimly lit coffee shops became our routine. Cassandra's methodical approach and my first-hand experiences gradually began to form a coherent picture. My mother and Keith had been working in tandem since before my stepdad's death, meticulously crafting a plan to divert his assets and funnel them into a hidden trust, one that was now earmarked, shockingly, for my future. But as we uncovered more evidence, the danger escalated. Cassandra confided that her own family had been the target of a similar scheme years ago, a tragic affair involving blackmail, extortion, and betrayal. Her cautionary tale served as both a warning and a rallying cry. "If we don't stop them now," she said with a tremor in her voice, "we'll be next. They'll use every trick in the book to silence us." The more I learned, the more I realized that our lives were entangled in a dark carnival of deceit, a twisted performance where everyone played a part. My mother, with her disarming smiles and feigned vulnerability, was the ringmaster. Keith, with his predatory charm and calculated advances, was the dangerous clown whose antics masked a ruthless agenda. And I was the unwilling star of a tragedy that I was determined to rewrite. Days bled into nights as I navigated this labyrinth of treachery. Every conversation felt like a veiled threat, every gesture a potential clue. I began to record my interactions with Keith on my phone, piecing together every offhand remark and coded message. In one recording, his tone was disturbingly casual as he discussed the inevitable shift in power that would occur once the trust was fully transferred. I listened repeatedly, each time feeling my blood run cold. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where my mother and Keith's conversation veered dangerously close to discussing the final steps, I decided that I could no longer remain a passive observer. I needed to act, if not to save myself, then to ensure that my stepdad's legacy was not tainted by their greed. I began planning a series of confrontations, covertly gathering every scrap of evidence that could one day expose the truth to the world. As the days passed, my internal struggle grew fiercer. A part of me longed for the simplicity of ignorance, to forget the treacherous web that had ensnared my family. But another part, fueled by anger and determination, demanded justice. Not just for my stepdad, but for every life ruined by deceit and betrayal. Nights were the worst. In the quiet darkness, memories of my stepdad's warm laughter and steadfast guidance clashed with the cold reality of my current existence. I would lie awake, haunted by visions of a younger, kinder version of him, and then snap back to the present, where my mother's manipulations and Keith's predatory smiles threatened to consume me entirely. I began to write letters addressed to an anonymous legal authority, detailing everything I had discovered. Each letter was a plea for intervention, a desperate cry for help that I feared would go unanswered. I hid copies in secret compartments around the house, hoping that someday, when the truth was undeniable, these documents would surface and bring justice. One stormy night, as lightning danced across the sky and thunder roared like the angry voice of fate, I was startled by a knock on the door. My heart raced. This was unusual, given that Keith and my mother rarely received unexpected visitors. I cautiously opened the door to find a stranger standing on the threshold. He was tall, with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me, and a quiet confidence that commanded attention. "Are you my name?" he asked in a measured tone. I hesitated, my mind racing with questions. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer. The man smiled faintly, as if he had been expecting my confusion. "My name is Daniel," he said. "I work for an agency that deals with cases exactly like yours. I believe you're in grave danger, and that what you've uncovered is only the tip of a very dark iceberg." His words sent shivers down my spine. Daniel explained that he had been following a trail of financial irregularities that pointed straight to the very family I now lived with. He had been tracking the flow of money from my stepdad's accounts and had noticed large, unaccounted transfers around the time of his death. Over the next hour, Daniel revealed details of a sprawling criminal network, a network that had exploited the vulnerabilities of grieving families for profit. "Your mother," he said gravely, "has been working with individuals far more dangerous than just a creepy boyfriend. They are professionals, experts at manipulation and fraud. And now, they've set their sights on you. Daniel's arrival marked a turning point. With his help, I began to see the bigger picture. A world where corruption and deceit were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader, insidious system. He provided me with access to encrypted files and warned me that every move I made would be watched. The stakes were higher than I'd ever imagined, and the danger was real. Yet, amidst the peril, a spark of hope flickered. Daniel promised that his agency would soon launch a full-scale investigation. The evidence I had gathered, my diary entries, the documents from my mother's study, and the damning recordings of Keith, would soon be enough to bring down the network. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to dream of a future free from fear and manipulation. A future where I could reclaim my life and honor the memory of my stepdad. But even as plans were set in motion, the house remained a pressure cooker of tension. My mother's laughter grew more forced, her smiles more brittle. Keith's behavior escalated into open hostility whenever he suspected that I was becoming too inquisitive. Every day was a precarious balancing act, where one wrong step could tip the scales into irreversible chaos. One humid summer evening, when the air seemed charged with impending calamity, the simmering tension reached its breaking point. My mother, in a rare moment of unguarded anger, confronted me in the living room. Her eyes, usually filled with a feigned warmth, now blazed with fury. "You think you know everything, don't you?" she spat, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. "All your snooping and your damn journal entries. Do you really think you can undo what's already been done?" Her words were laced with a bitterness that cut deeper than any physical blow. I stood my ground, my voice steadier than I felt. "I won't let you ruin everything," I said, every word a declaration of independence. "You killed him, and now you're trying to steal what's mine." The room fell silent, the weight of her guilt palpable in the charged air. For a long moment, she simply stared at me, as if trying to decide whether to confess or to tighten the veil of lies that had defined her existence. Before she could reply, the sound of a door slamming echoed through the house. Keith had entered the room, his presence as imposing as ever. With a sneer, he interjected, "That's enough, kid. You don't know what you're talking about." But I could see the hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that betrayed his carefully constructed facade. In that instant, everything changed. The confrontation, the accusations, and the charged atmosphere crystallized into a moment of clarity. I realized that the only way to break free from this web of lies was to expose every secret, no matter how painful, no matter how dangerous. And so, with a newfound resolve, I vowed that I would uncover every hidden truth, even if it meant tearing apart the very fabric of my family. The days that followed were a blur of clandestine meetings, frantic research, and whispered conversations in shadowed corners. Cassandra and I became partners in a dangerous game of cat and mouse, piecing together clues that spanned years. We spent countless hours poring over bank records, cross-referencing dates, and tracking the movement of funds. Every discovery brought us closer to the heart of the conspiracy, but also deeper into a maze of peril. I began to notice changes in my own behavior. The quiet, anxious child I once was slowly giving way to someone hardened by betrayal and fueled by a burning need for justice. Late at night, when the world was asleep, I would sit at my desk, my eyes red from exhaustion, and write out every detail I could remember. I wrote not only for myself, but for the ghost of my stepdad, a man who had trusted me with his legacy, only to have it desecrated by those he once loved. One evening, as I was reviewing a particularly damning set of financial transactions, Cassandra burst into my room. "You need to see this," she said breathlessly, holding up a stack of papers. They contained a series of coded messages, a ledger that recorded discrete payments, and a timeline that pointed unmistakably to a premeditated plan. According to the ledger, the death of my stepdad had been orchestrated long before it ever happened, and every subsequent move was calculated to ensure that the inheritance would fall into the wrong hands. My hands trembled as I absorbed the magnitude of the betrayal. The pages before me were not just ink on paper. They were a record of every lie, every deceit, and every act of cruelty that had been perpetrated under the guise of familial love. In that moment, I realized that the only way to reclaim my future was to bring all of this into the light. Yet, as the investigation deepened, so did the danger. I began receiving cryptic warnings. A threatening note slipped under my door, an anonymous phone call with a distorted voice warning me to stop digging. It was clear that the conspirators were aware of my actions, and they would not hesitate to silence me if I got too close to the truth. One particularly harrowing night, I awoke to find the envelope I had hidden under my pillow had been rifled through. Panic gripped me as I realized that every piece of evidence I had painstakingly gathered was now compromised. I couldn't help but wonder, had I been too obvious? Had my enemies grown so cunning that they could infiltrate even my private sanctum? In the days that followed, the tension in the house became unbearable. My mother's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would pace the halls late at night, muttering to herself about lost opportunities and the weight of the past. Keith, on the other hand, became overtly aggressive, his once sly demeanor replaced by a menacing hostility that left me constantly on edge. But amidst the growing fear, I found strength in my determination. I reached out to Daniel once again, updating him on every new development. His reassurances, delivered in a calm and measured tone, were a lifeline in the storm of uncertainty. "Keep gathering what you can," he urged, "and trust no one completely. The path to justice is never easy, but you are not alone in this fight." One rainy afternoon, while I was alone in the attic sorting through old family albums and relics of a happier past, I stumbled upon a photograph that changed everything. It was a candid shot of my stepdad with a group of men I didn't recognize. Men whose faces were etched with the same cold determination that I had seen in Keith's eyes. The photograph, taken at a family gathering decades ago, hinted at alliances and loyalties that I had never been aware of. The realization hit me hard. My stepdad had been involved in something larger than I had ever imagined. Could it be that his death was not just a result of greed, but part of a much larger conspiracy that spanned decades and involved powerful figures? The more I thought about it, the more I felt that the answers lay hidden in the murky intersections of family, business, and old secrets that were meant to stay buried. Determined to unearth the truth, I began revisiting old conversations with relatives and friends. Each story was a patch in the quilt of betrayal, a tapestry woven from whispered rumors, half-forgotten scandals, and painful confessions. Slowly, I started piecing together a narrative that pointed to a long-standing feud, one where loyalty was measured not in love, but in the accumulation of wealth and power. As summer yielded to autumn, the atmosphere in our home grew increasingly oppressive. The days were shorter, the nights colder, and the very walls seemed to pulse with the anticipation of an inevitable reckoning. My every step felt watched, every conversation layered with unspoken threats. I could sense that the hour of judgment was drawing near, a moment when the carefully constructed facade of our family would shatter, revealing the raw, painful truth beneath. I found solace in the small acts of rebellion that I could manage. Late at night, I would slip out to the local diner, where the low hum of conversation and the clink of coffee cups provided a temporary escape. There, I confided in strangers who, though unaware of the full extent of my troubles, offered me the kindness and empathy that I so desperately needed. Their compassion, though fleeting, bolstered my resolve and reminded me that I was fighting not just for myself, but for the memory of a man who had once believed in justice. In the midst of the mounting pressure, the relationship between my mother and Keith began to unravel. Their interactions, once marked by a sinister synchrony, started to fracture. I overheard heated arguments, accusations flung like daggers in the dark. My mother's voice, usually so controlled and measured, now cracked with desperation. Keith's retorts, once laced with mocking humor, turned cold and biting. One evening, as I lay hidden behind the slightly ajar door of the living room, I heard my mother cry out, "You don't understand. This is our only chance to fix everything." Her voice trembled, caught between rage and sorrow. Keith's reply was equally frantic. "It's too late. Once we cross this line, there's no turning back." Their words, barely audible over the hum of the old house, resonated with the finality of a death knell. That night, I made a decision. I would no longer be a passive observer in this drama of treachery and deceit. I resolved to gather every shred of evidence, every confession, every piece of the puzzle, no matter the cost. The stakes had never been higher, and I knew that the next few days would be the most dangerous of my life. With Cassandra and Daniel's cautious guidance, I began to plan a daring move, a direct confrontation that would force my mother and Keith to reveal their true intentions. It was a risky gambit. To draw out the conspirators by feigning vulnerability while secretly recording every word and gesture. We arranged for a family dinner, a final act in the farce that had become our daily existence. The table was set in the grand dining room, its long mahogany surface a silent witness to years of hidden sins. My mother, dressed immaculately as always, greeted us with a strained smile. Keith, leaning casually against the doorway, exuded a dangerous confidence that belied the tension in the air. Cassandra and I sat quietly, our eyes locked on each other in a silent pact to see this through. As the dinner progressed, conversation meandered through trivial topics before, inevitably, turning to the matter of the inheritance. My mother's tone became guarded, her smile faltering. Keith's eyes darted nervously between us, his usual swagger replaced by palpable anxiety. Sensing the perfect moment, I pressed on with feigned nonchalance. "I was just wondering," I began, voice steady despite the storm raging inside me, "what will happen to the trust if nothing changes?" A heavy silence fell over the room. My mother's fork paused midair, and Keith's hand tightened on the stem of his wine glass. The tension was so thick I could almost taste it. In that suspended moment, I could see the cracks in their carefully constructed facade, the guilt, the fear, and the undeniable truth that what they had planned was now unraveling before my eyes. The confrontation reached its climax in a cacophony of hushed confessions and desperate denials. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she stammered, "I did it for us, for the family. I thought I was doing what was best." Her words were a jumble of regret and justification, a desperate attempt to make sense of the senseless. Keith, red-faced and agitated, tried to interject, but his voice faltered as I pressed the evidence forward. Photographs, letters, and the damning ledger. "Your lies have cost me everything," I declared, my voice echoing in the silent room. "You manipulated every loss, every moment of grief, to serve your own twisted ends. And now, you expect to take away what should have been mine, my inheritance, my future, my identity." For a long, heart-stopping moment, the room was frozen in time. The weight of their deceit bore down on us all, a crushing force that threatened to shatter what little remained of our sanity. Then, in a desperate burst of emotion, my mother broke down. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, her voice barely a whisper. "I never meant for any of this to happen." But her tears could not wash away the stains of betrayal that had been etched into every corner of our lives. As the confrontation spiraled into chaos, Keith lunged forward, his face twisted in a mask of rage and desperation. I braced myself for the impact, knowing that this moment of truth might well be the point of no return. The struggle was fierce, a violent ballet of accusations, physical tussles, and the raw expression of emotions that had been simmering for too long. In the midst of it all, I clutched the evidence, a silent testament to the truth, and vowed that nothing would ever be the same. In the aftermath of that fateful dinner, the house was left in ruins, not just of shattered glass and broken promises, but of trust and familial bonds that could never be repaired. My mother retreated into herself, a broken shell of a person whose eyes no longer held the spark of deception, but the dull sheen of regret. Keith, his true nature laid bare, vanished into the night, leaving behind only a lingering sense of foreboding and an unspoken promise that this was far from over. I spent countless hours in that once familiar home, now transformed into a battleground of memories and regrets. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind through the cracked windows, reminded me of the choices that had led me to this point. Cassandra's visits became a lifeline, her steady presence a reminder that I was not alone in this fight. Together, we sorted through the debris of our shattered lives, determined to salvage the truth from the wreckage. Yet, even as the evidence mounted and the walls of our home seemed to crumble under the weight of our shared pain, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling that the worst was yet to come. Daniel's ominous warnings echoed in my mind. They will not let you expose everything without a fight. And fight they did. In the weeks that followed, as the investigation gained momentum, unexpected allies emerged from the shadows. A local journalist, known for her tenacity in uncovering corrupt schemes, reached out with offers of support and a promise to bring our story to light. Her name was Miranda, and she had a reputation for turning whispered rumors into explosive exposés. With her help, I began to see a path forward, a way to dismantle the network of lies piece by piece. Miranda's articles started to surface online, hinting at the dark underbelly of what many in our community had long suspected. They spoke of financial irregularities, of families manipulated for profit, and of a shadowy cabal that thrived on secrets. Although the full extent of the conspiracy remained shrouded in mystery, the public was beginning to take notice. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to hope that justice might prevail. Yet, with hope came risk. The conspirators, now aware that their secrets were leaking into the light, grew bolder in their attempts to silence me. Anonymous threats escalated into overt acts of intimidation. My phone would ring in the middle of the night with chilling messages, and I often found myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a dark figure lurking in the peripheral shadows. As autumn deepened and the days grew shorter, the tension in our lives reached a fever pitch. The evidence that I had gathered was now the cornerstone of a burgeoning investigation, a spark that threatened to ignite a firestorm of revelations. My heart raced every time I thought of the inheritance, now more than ever a symbol of what had been lost and what might yet be reclaimed. In one final act of defiance, I made the decision to confront the masterminds head-on. I arranged a meeting with Daniel, Cassandra, and Miranda in a secluded spot away from prying eyes, a derelict warehouse on the outskirts of town that had become our clandestine headquarters. Under the dim light of a single hanging bulb, we laid out our plans, our voices low and urgent as we strategized the next steps. "We have enough evidence," Daniel insisted, his eyes steely with resolve. "But we need to move quickly. They know we're on to them, and they won't hesitate to silence us if we delay any further." Cassandra nodded in agreement. "Every moment counts. If we can expose their network, we can put an end to this nightmare once and for all." Miranda's gaze was unwavering as she added, "I'll publish the next piece tomorrow. It's the tipping point. The world needs to know the truth, and they'll be forced to act." With our plans set in motion, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The burdens of betrayal and loss were heavy, but they were now the fuel that powered my determination. I was no longer just a victim of my circumstances. I was a warrior armed with truth, ready to dismantle the empire of lies that had haunted my family for far too long. In the weeks after that explosive dinner, the house was transformed from a stage of covert maneuvers to a ticking time bomb of impending retribution. Every creak of the wooden floors and every hushed whisper in the dark reminded me that the moment of reckoning was nearing. I spent countless sleepless nights poring over the evidence, photographs, ledgers, recordings, and Cassandra's painstaking notes, while Daniel, Miranda, and I coordinated our next steps with cautious urgency. The very air in our home felt electric, charged with a mixture of raw fear and defiant resolve. Even as my mother sank deeper into guilt and Keith's shadow seemed to lurk at every corner, I began to gather the final pieces of my plan. The evidence I had accumulated was irrefutable, and I knew that once presented to the authorities, the full extent of their deceit would be exposed to the world. Yet, there was also an overwhelming sadness. The man I had once looked up to, my stepdad, had been wronged, and the family I had once trusted was now torn apart by greed and lies. One chilly autumn evening, as dark clouds loomed overhead, the inevitable confrontation arrived. I had arranged a final meeting, a family confrontation meant to force every hidden truth into the light. Cassandra and I had scheduled a clandestine rendezvous with Daniel in the family's living room, a room that had borne witness to too many secrets. The door creaked open and my mother entered, her eyes swollen from nights of guilt and regret. Keith was already there, lurking by the doorway, his demeanor a mix of defiance and anxiety. The air was thick with tension as I laid out all the evidence on the long mahogany dining table. The ledger documenting the illicit transactions, the photos capturing clandestine meetings, and the audio recordings of Keith's incriminating remarks were spread before us like a gallery of treachery. "Enough!" I demanded, my voice echoing in the silence. "I know everything. How you manipulated everyone after Dad's death, how you used his passing to steal his money, and how you've plotted to secure my inheritance at any cost." My mother's eyes filled with tears as she attempted to justify her actions. "I did it for us, for the family's survival," she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought it was the only way." But there was no redemption in her words, only a hollow justification for actions that had torn us all apart. Keith stepped forward, trying to interject. "You have no idea what you're saying," he snarled, but his bravado crumbled as the evidence, so meticulously gathered, left him with nowhere to hide. His face reddened with a mix of anger and fear as I replayed the recording of his earlier conversation, a moment when he coldly discussed securing the trust at all costs. In that charged moment, the facade of our perverse family was stripped away. With trembling hands, I pressed a button on my phone and recorded every word of the confrontation. Daniel, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "This ends tonight. We have enough proof to bring in the authorities. You can no longer hide behind your lies." The air vibrated with the finality of his words. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the relentless patter of rain against the windows. Then, as if in response to the inevitability of justice, Keith lunged toward me. In the ensuing scuffle, chaos reigned. Shattered porcelain, anguished cries, and desperate attempts to snatch the evidence from my hands. I struggled to fend him off, adrenaline surging, until Daniel and Cassandra intervened. The struggle was brief but brutal, and in its aftermath, Keith lay subdued, his eyes wide with the shock of defeat. The confrontation was over, but its reverberations were only beginning to be felt. I immediately contacted Daniel's agency and shared every recording, every document, the full narrative of how my stepdad's death had been exploited for greed and power. Miranda's articles, already circulating online, gained a new layer of credibility as the raw evidence was unveiled. It wasn't long before law enforcement arrived at the house. The local police, alongside agents from Daniel's agency, took Keith into custody, while my mother was placed under intense scrutiny. In the sterile light of a police interrogation room, my mother's defenses finally crumbled. Between anguished sobs, she recounted how fear and desperation had driven her to make unthinkable decisions. "I lost a man I loved," she confessed, voice trembling. "When everything fell apart, I thought I could fix it by taking what was left. I never imagined it would hurt you so much." Her confession painted a picture of a woman trapped by her own mistakes, a tragic figure whose misguided choices had unleashed a torrent of betrayal. Keith, in his own interrogation, offered little more than incoherent ramblings of self-preservation. It soon became clear that he was nothing more than a hired pawn, a man who had willingly participated in a far more complex and sinister plot masterminded by powerful figures hidden in the background. As the legal process unfolded, it became evident that the conspiracy extended beyond our household. Financial investigators and federal agents began uncovering connections between the misappropriated funds and a broader criminal network specializing in defrauding grieving families. The evidence I had risked so much to gather was now the key to dismantling an empire built on exploitation and greed. The days following the arrest were a blur of court hearings, media frenzy, and personal reckoning. Public opinion was swift to judge. The story that unfolded was featured on major news outlets and spread like wildfire across social media. For many, it was a cautionary tale about the lengths to which some would go to secure wealth and the collateral damage left in its wake. I found myself at a crossroads. The trauma of the past months, the relentless anxiety, the betrayals, the physical and emotional scars, left me questioning everything I thought I knew about family and loyalty. In quiet moments, I revisited memories of my stepdad, his gentle guidance, his unshakable integrity, and the promise of a future that had been cruelly stolen away. It was in these moments of introspection that I began to understand that, while the wounds might never fully heal, the truth had set me free. Cassandra became a steadfast companion through these turbulent times. Together, we attended support meetings and sought therapy, determined to rebuild our lives from the fragments of shattered trust. Our shared pain forged an unbreakable bond, one that was rooted not in victimhood, but in the fierce determination to rise above our past. Miranda's articles continued to expose the dark underbelly of the criminal network. With every published piece, the conspirators' hold over their ill-gotten gains weakened. Slowly, justice was being served not only for my family, but for countless others who had suffered similar betrayals. The courage it took to stand up against those who would exploit tragedy for profit inspired a community of survivors to speak out, demanding accountability and change. Months passed. The trials concluded with sentences that sent ripples through the community, a stark reminder that no one was above the law. My mother, burdened by remorse and legal consequences, retreated into a long, solitary process of atonement. Keith's role in the scheme was fully exposed, and his arrest was but one chapter in a much larger dismantling of the network that had orchestrated so many tragedies. As for me, I began to reclaim my life. The inheritance that had once symbolized my stolen future was now returned to me, untouched by the machinations of greed. More importantly, I gained something far more valuable: the clarity that comes from surviving a storm of deceit and emerging with your truth intact. I moved out of the oppressive house that had been both a prison and a battleground, seeking solace in a small apartment filled with natural light and the promise of a fresh start. With the support of Cassandra and a slowly rebuilding community, I began to write down my story, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of betrayal. My writings, later compiled and shared online, resonated with thousands, sparking discussions about justice, the abuse of power, and the importance of standing up for one's rights even when the stakes are impossibly high. The journey was far from over. There were scars that would always serve as a reminder of the past, and every now and then, a familiar pang of loss would resurface. Yet, in those moments, I reminded myself that the darkness had been dispelled by the light of truth. I had transformed from a frightened, isolated child into someone who had faced down the very embodiment of corruption, and in doing so, had reclaimed my identity and my future. In time, I found peace in the realization that while some wounds might never fully close, the process of healing was a continuous journey. I embraced the support of friends, new relationships, and a community that had been galvanized by the courage to speak out against injustice. I dedicated myself to advocacy work, determined to help others who found themselves caught in the web of deceit and manipulation. If any part of this story resonated with you, or if you've experienced similar challenges, know that you are not alone. Sometimes the hardest battles lead to the brightest dawns.